women on the Strip.
He was called in by the task force on several different occasions to be interviewed, and even though he had killed a woman 3 weeks before one of the major interviews by the task force, he displayed no signs of nervousness.
Ridgway's composure even allowed him to pass a polygraph test.
The polygraph test is based upon one's guilty emotions. And if you don't ever feel guilty about what you've done, you're going to be able to pull the wool over somebody's eyes.
But Ridgway couldn't completely fool task force detectives. In 1987, he came under even more scrutiny. Once again, it was the pickup trucks he drove while trolling for victims that drew detectives to him.
The deeper we looked at Ridgway, the more it became obvious that he was available for every single one of those appearance dates. We're working on credit card records, every single place where he bought gas, and we checked out how many miles it would take to drive to and from work every day and how much that would normally burn up. Well, he was burning up many, many gallons of gas, way beyond, and that's just what he was charged. We had a couple of witnesses, when they were shown the photo montage containing Ridgway's photo, they would say, well, it looks a lot like this one, and point to his picture.
Prosecutors and detectives thought about arresting Ridgway.
But we didn't have anywhere near enough to make a conviction because it was all circumstantial.
Investigators got a warrant to search Ridgway's house, hoping to find physical evidence that proved he was the killer. But the search came up empty.
Mr. Ridgway was simply very good at what he did. According to Mr. Ridgway, he killed all of the women in his bedroom. His practice was as soon as he finished killing them, he would often take the sheets off his bed, throw them in the washer even before he left with the woman's body, and dumped it out at a scene. So he left behind nothing, essentially.
Once again, Gary Ridgway slipped free from the law.
And I think he starts playing more of a game of moving pieces around. He's moving skeletons around. He's moving bodies around.
He did change his MO. He was taking bodies further out into the woods or the mountains because he didn't want their bodies found.
Free to visit the ever-widening areas where his victims were discarded, Gary Ridgway continued to hunt and kill, convinced nothing could ever stop him. By 1988, more than 40 women had vanished in what had come to be known as the Green River Killings. And the killer, Gary Ridgway, was still on the loose. At this point, Ridgway wasn't just evading the police. He was hiding his murderous ways so well that yet another woman agreed to become his wife. Ridgway married wife number 3, Judith Lynch, in 1988.
When they first moved here, they were newlyweds. Their eyes sparkled, they were always smiling, and they were always happy, and you just never seen them apart, ever.
But love and marriage did not end Ridgway's insatiable desire to kill. He continued to murder, while managing to keep his new wife completely unaware.
He could be Gary Ridgway, the husband, and drive off in the truck and become Gary Ridgway, the killer, and come back home and be the husband again, and never give her any reason to think he was anything but that.
He had his killing career that he did out of sight from any other people, and he had the rest of his life where he was a father and he was a husband and he was an employee.
There was an inkling at the Kenworth truck plant, where Ridgway had worked for years, that he was hiding something. After all, his co-workers knew that police had questioned him in the mid-1980s.
We had the unique experience of having to work next to him, always thinking, could he be or couldn't he be? And everybody had their own opinions. Some people thought he was, some people thought he wasn't.
You wouldn't want to have a beer with him, you wouldn't want him to come over to your house. He just was a different type of a person.
Some employees at Kenworth even gave him a nickname, Green River Gary. Little did they know what he was doing to them. Ridgway later told investigators that once in a while he would use jewelry that he'd stolen from his victims to play a joke on his co-workers.
He put the jewelry in places where people could find them, where he worked. And one of the employees picked it up, put it on, and had a real good find. In Gary's mind, I think he walked very quietly and had a little smirk on his face, and there was a big smile inside of him, reminding him of the young ladies he killed.
And that isn't all he apparently did with his victim's possession.
He had huge garage sales, and he'd have just gobs of stuff.
I guess the kind of funny thing I always saw was a lot of jewelry, a lot of young girls' jewelry, and a lot of mixed pairs of shoes.
Gary Ridgway was sure that he had his neighbors, his co-workers, the cops, and everyone else completely fooled.
But I think after a while, he was winning the game. And he says, hey, I'm doing pretty good.
So well, in fact, that the police investigation was forced to slow down. Though Ridgway was still killing, far fewer bodies were being found. As the case dragged on with no resolution, the investigation task force steadily got smaller and smaller.
By 1990, there were 5 of us left. I left in April of 90. There's 4 left. By 1992, Tom Jensen's the only guy left.
I tried to keep it alive as best I could in the mind of the public.
It began to seem hopeless until modern technology gave investigators some help they desperately needed. Back in the 80s, detectives had painstakingly taken samples from crime scenes. They didn't even know what good it might do, but they cataloged it and stored it anyway.
They refrigerated it and preserved it because, you know, sometimes people can say, well, this is not doing anything good. It's just taking up room in our evidence room. Let's get rid of it. That didn't happen.
Their foresight didn't begin to pay off until the summer of 2001, when DNA technology was finally good enough to analyze that evidence from the 80s. 19 years after a woman named Marcia Chapman was strangled and left to rot on the banks of the Green River, samples taken when her body was discovered went to the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab.
There was spermatozoa there, and we were able to generate a male DNA typing profile that matched Gary Ridgway. It's really amazing, the profiles we got.
Then they tested samples from victim Carol Christensen. Again, a match with Ridgway. For all those years, Gary Ridgway had gotten away with murder. Finally, the cops had the proof they needed to nail him.
We had tears in our eyes. It was a great moment. One I won't forget.
And there was even more good news on the way. New techniques could now identify microscopic particles of paint collected years earlier at the crime scenes. And scientists were able to link them directly to Ridgway.
We find out there's spray paint, which was chemically identical, at least, to the material that Gary Ridgway was working with at the plant where he worked. He was bringing paint particles, unbeknownst to him, into his vehicle, into his home, and if victims were in his vehicle in his home, those would be transferred as well.
And this is where Ridgway wasn't thinking very clearly. Those paint samples matched exactly.
With evidence in hand, the task force would soon put an end to Gary Ridgway's reign of terror. For nearly 20 years, Gary Ridgway found perverse pleasure in murdering dozens of women and getting